Thank you to Dean Tobin for sharing those remarks with us. And we're going to keep rolling. And the next panel of the day, I will hand off to Sarah Everhart, who's going to moderate this panel.
Thanks, Megan. So last but certainly not least, we have a panel that's, I think, near and dear to all of our hearts here in Delmarva. We are going to be talking about some legislative strategies for reaching the ag sector's 2025 Chesapeake Bay cleanup goals. And I don't think we could have two more qualified people to lead the discussion today. We're happy to have Jason Kempler with us. Jason's got a lot of titles. I'll list a few. Watershed Implementation Program Manager, Acting Conservation Grants Program Manager at the Maryland Department of Agriculture. And we also have Mark Hoffman. Mark's the Maryland Director for the Chesapeake Bay Commission. So I will hand it over to them. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Jason Kempler, Maryland Department of Agriculture. So Mark and I are going to tag team talking about Chesapeake Bay restoration efforts. I'm going to tee it up and talk a little bit about the plan that's in place to help us meet our bay restoration goals by 2025. Then Mark will dive into some of the specifics as it relates to recent legislative initiatives and things of that sort. So I'm going to start with my primer here and basically just give you an overview of Chesapeake restoration regarding Maryland's role in that. Let me go ahead and click over to the right screen here. So for those that may not be familiar, obviously, Maryland is a diverse state, not only in terms of topography, geography as a whole, but also in terms of agricultural production. So over on the Eastern Shore, traditionally, obviously, there's a lot of poultry production, flatter ground, a lot of row crop production to support that poultry industry as you move across to the western part of the state, across the Bay Bridge. Historically, Southern Maryland, there was a lot of tobacco that was grown that's has been mostly converted over into other types of production. As you move up, into the more urban areas, obviously there's more equine and horse industries, maybe some smaller animal agricultural operation. And as you go out west, it becomes more ridge and valley, supporting animal agriculture, dairy industry, hay industry, things of that sort. So again, quite a diverse landscape as it relates to agriculture. So that presents some unique challenges if we're talking about how to address any resource concerns that may exist on those farms across the state. So just a background, some statistics as it relates to ag. So over 12,000 farms throughout Maryland, a lot of small farms, 1.3 million acres of harvested cropland, over 3 million birds produced annually through the poultry industry, almost $1 billion. So it's a huge financial driver as it relates to agriculture in Maryland. Dairy industry, about 50,000 head. That number was from a few years ago, so it may have actually declined a little bit since then, but still over 170 million thousand in production annually. Crop production, again, I mentioned supporting the animal industry, most notably the poultry industry. 400,000 acres of corn produced, over 500 in soybeans, and then 260,000 in winter wheat. There's a number of growing number of small or diverse operations, direct to consumer, produce operations, wineries, breweries, a lot of agritourism, especially in Southern Maryland, where a lot of that tobacco land has been converted into other things. So again, provides a lot of diversity throughout the state. So how do we deliver conservation on the ground? Well, conservation districts were created as a result of the Dust Bowl back in the 30s. And back then, these district offices essentially helped address soil erosion on agricultural land to ensure long-term sustainability of crop production, et cetera. So back in the early 30s, 40s, there were conservation districts established in each of the counties throughout Maryland, with the exception of Baltimore City, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. One notable exception was Frederick County. Actually is split into two. There are two separate conservation districts in Frederick County. One is on the eastern part of the county is the formal Frederick Soil Conservation District, and then there's a Catoctin Soil Conservation District that's separate. So separate watersheds managed by separate board of supervisors, but still share a common goal. And we have staff in that county that actually support both of those districts. Again, the first district was formed back in 1938 in Kent County. The primary focus of those conservation districts back then and today is to provide technical and financial assistance to landowners and farmers to address resource concerns on their farms. And the districts themselves are actually, there's an advocacy group, the Maryland Association of Soil Conservation Districts, that actually help provide the voice that's so desperately needed in some cases by those districts to the state legislatures and other folks. This is our primary delivery mechanism in terms of getting conservation on the ground and on agriculture. So just to talk more specifically about the Maryland Department of Ag, I work in the Office of Resource Conservation, which is a unit within MDA as a whole. So our Office of Resource Conservation, our mission is to protect and conserve natural resources and promote Maryland ag by providing leadership, resources, and support to the ag community to benefit everyone in the state of Maryland. So we began our technical assistance efforts back in the 40s by supporting those conservation district offices. And then over the course of time, obviously, focus has shifted and we've expanded our role. In the 80s, the early 1980s, there was a desire or a need to really take a hard look at Chesapeake Bay. Water quality was continuing to decline, and there was obviously a desire to improve water quality. So as a result of that, the state created a Maryland Agricultural Water Quality Cost Share Program that helps provide financial assistance to farmers to implement conservation on the ground. That's expanded over time to not only include our formal MAX program, which is more or less structural practices that are placed on farms, but we also have our cover crop program, our manure transport program, and we continue to expand our MAX offerings as we go. And I'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. We have a strong partnership with our federal partners, as well as our other state and local partners as well. And then finally, the nutrient management laws were passed back in the late 90s as a result of the Listeria outbreak. So our nutrient management program actually provides regulatory oversight regarding nutrient management in Maryland. So in building this conservation delivery system, you see in the middle here, our local conservation district offices are the hub. They're really the key in helping farmers address their resource concerns, finding the appropriate programs to help provide financial assistance, help them with the technical assistance in terms of design and implementation of those practices. So it's really a combination of our USDA partners at NRCS and FSA, state partners, DNR, MDE, University of Maryland Extension, local government, so whether it's our local elected officials or the local planning departments, things of that sort, obviously are all critical components of this delivery system. And then I already mentioned the Maryland Association of Conservation Districts as being the voice or advocacy group behind supporting the conservation districts. So let's talk about bay restoration for a minute. As you can see on the map over on the right-hand side, for those that may not be familiar, the bay watershed actually extends all the way up into the upper part of New York, right outside of Cooperstown, New York, and drains through a better part of the Pennsylvania, down through Maryland, through the Susquehanna, and then we also have portions of West Virginia, Delaware to the west and to the east of Maryland, and then Virginia going all the way out to the Shenandoah Valley to the tidewater. So you can see it's a large watershed, 64,000 square mile watershed that really there's a lot of land, a lot of water that drains from those areas that really contribute to the water quality that we see today. So back in 1983, there was a simple bay agreement that was signed among, I believe it was just Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, saying we need to do something to restore the Chesapeake Bay. So it was a simple pledge. And at the same time, EPA actually established a special Chesapeake Bay program office dedicated to bay restoration. Over the series of years, the Bay agreements became more formal. In 1987, there was some more meat put on those, where the states agreed to reduce nitrogen and phosphorus pollution by 40%. There was a Chesapeake 2000 agreement, or C2K as it was affectionately known, that established 102 goals beyond just water quality. So that we looked at wildlife habitat, land management. We started bringing fisheries into this, whether it was oyster recovery or certain controlling the fish stocks, things of that sort. So a lot of goals were established, as we progressed through time. States were making progress, but there was a recognition that more needed to be done. So as a result of that, plus a lawsuit that was filed, the President Obama back in 2009 declared the Chesapeake Bay as a national treasure and called on all the federal resources to help with a renewed effort to restore the Chesapeake Bay. And as a result, EPA established a formal total maximum daily load for the Chesapeake Bay, which is essentially a pollution diet. It's how much nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment could enter the bay and the bay still attain a certain level of water quality that's acceptable. So that TMDL was based on pounds of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment that could be delivered. And then that TMDL was essentially distributed out to each of the states within the watershed, and then each of the main sectors of pollution within those states. So whether that's agriculture, the wastewater treatment plants, the urban stormwater folks, as well as the septic folks, those are the four main source sectors of pollution for the bay. So each of the source sectors in each of the states were responsible for a certain amount of reduction. And to meet those goals, each of the states had to develop a watershed implementation plan, or WIP for short, to meet those goals. So a WIP was developed for each of those. EPA is the evaluation mechanism to ensure that we're meeting our bay restoration goals. And we use a model, we call it the Bay model, but really it's a series of models to predict the amount of reduction that may occur, not only at a watershed, like a local watershed scale, but at the estuary scale. There's airshed models that simulate the amount of pollution that is deposited within the watershed and ultimately makes it down through the local tributaries and into the main stem of the bay. So it's a quite complex model, even though we just we use the term just bay model. Really, there's a number of different models, and that's our scorecard, if you will, that we're held to on an annual basis. I mentioned the major source sectors of pollution, and this basically outlines each of those sectors' roles in Maryland's plan. So you can see, we have the three main ones, and wastewater being by far the largest. There's a dedicated fund, the BRF fund. Mark will talk about that a little bit more later, but there's a dedicated funding source. This is our flush fee in Maryland that we all pay into to help with upgrading the major wastewater treatment plants, as well as helping with septic connections and other things. And there are additional uses for that money that Mark will talk about in a little bit. Ag, cost share, our MAX program, I mentioned that before. There's nutrient management planning, our phosphorus management tool, cover crops, the conservation reserve enhancement program. There's a number of different initiatives that the agricultural sector's undertaken. And then finally, the urban stormwater sector, looking at development stormwater standards, MS4 permitting, so the phase 1 and phase 2 permitting, making sure that those urban counties have those plans in place and they're following those plans. So it's a pretty comprehensive watershed implementation plan, and I'm not really going to get into too many details other than we do have this plan in place, and we are actively trying to implement that out to 2025. Just to real quickly show you the amount of pollution that was entering the Chesapeake Bay from Maryland. You can see in 1985, the pie chart, this is in terms of nitrogen loads or nitrogen pollution. 84 million pounds of nitrogen was being delivered to the Chesapeake Bay back in 85. And you can see by the pie chart where those came from. So about 41% was from ag, 38 from wastewater, and 8% from developed. And we have some of the septic and natural, those are smaller slices of the pie. But since 85 to 2017, when this phase 3 of the WIP took place, there was a significant amount of load reduction that occurred, about 30 million pounds that occurred. So of that 30 million pounds, about 2/3 came from wastewater treatment plant upgrades, and the other third came from ag implementation. So you can see that there has been a significant amount of load reduction since 1985, since that first Bay Agreement was signed. We still have a lot of work to do, but ag and wastewater certainly continue to carry the day in terms of nitrogen reductions. And then here's a similar slide for phosphorus, again showing the relative size of the pie chart. So 7.4 million pounds of phosphorus down to 3.7. So again, significant amount, roughly the same amount of reduction between ag versus wastewater, where ag was responsible for about 1/3 and wastewater about 2/3. Most of the load reduction on phosphorus and wastewater is a result of low phosphorus detergents and things of that sort too. Beyond just looking at model results, there are other indicators of bay health that we certainly look at. So looking at the living resources, whether it's the bay grasses, the submerged aquatic vegetation, that's linked to nutrient reduction. So the clearer the water is, the better the grasses will grow. So this is, we've seen a lot of bay grasses respond to bay restoration efforts, and there's been a lot more bay grasses. DNR performs an annual assessment of bay grasses, so they have more information about that. DNR also looks at blue crab populations, and like I said before, fisheries management, making sure that we're providing the necessary habitat for all of our aquatic species to grow. And then oyster aquaculture is another, oyster recovery rather, is another important indicator in Harris Creek over on the shore, the first fully restored oyster reef in the Chesapeake Bay. So it goes beyond just looking at model numbers, that we're looking at real real indicators of better bay health. And then, there's a number of different report cards that get published on an annual basis. The University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science publishes theirs. This is the Chesapeake and Watershed Report Card. You can find out more information about their overall assessment, but they look at individual tributaries within the watershed, watersheds of Maryland, and provide a grading based on how we're performing, and basically what the overall trend is. So as of last year, they gave us between a C and a C plus, and we're trending upward, meaning that we continue to make improvements. So that's encouraging to hear that. Again, outside of the model results, we do have other science-based report cards that tell us that we're heading in the right direction. So there's a number of different things that we do on farms to help with our load reductions or addressing those resource concerns. Again, nutrient management is regulatory in nature, but there are also some voluntary practices that we encourage farmers to participate in and provide cost share systems for. Our cover crop program is a huge program for us to the tune of over $22 million a year. We try to plant at least 450,000 acres of cover crops annually. We have pasture management and grazing BMPs, so help supporting rotational grazing systems or horse pasture management, agricultural drainage management systems over on the shore, whether they're bioreactors or saturated buffers, drainage water management. Those are all key practices to help us manage water that's leaving agricultural fields. And then we have our traditional practices like our forest and grass buffers, wetland restoration, tree plantings, soil conservation planning, manure transport, a lot of different tools in our toolbox to help us meet our goals by 2025. So if you take a look at those individual tools and compare them related to the amount of nitrogen that they reduce, you can see that each one of these pie slices, and we call these, this is an old chart, but it's just for illustrative purposes. All of the slices in green are ag practices. So you can see that, for instance, cover crop manages about 10% of our nitrogen loads. Conservation tillage about almost 9%. Grass buffers 8%. But really the take-home message here is that there's no one silver single bullet that's going to help us meet our bay restoration goals. We need all of these practices working together to help us meet our nitrogen load reductions. And you can see over on the left-hand side of the pie charts where we get into our urban practices, whether in the case of yellow, those are the stormwater practices, and then the red and pink are wastewater and septic respectively. But you can see that there's a number of different practices that we use to help us with our reductions. And then similarly with phosphorus, you'll notice that the amount of ag in that pie chart is about the same as nitrogen, but the practices themselves are completely different. So you'll see things like poultry phytase, animal waste management, conservation planning, and tillage. Those are all important practices. Again, the take-home message is we need all of these practices implemented on ag land to help us meet our goals. It's just not cover crop. It's just not nutrient management. It's a combination of all of these things. So we put together our plan, and I'm not going to go into specifics about this, but we have the amount of each of these practices that we need to implement by 2025. So whether it's conservation tillage or manure incorporation, what have you, we have specific goals, numeric goals, statewide that we need to achieve by 2025 to meet our bay restoration goals. So the first page was our annual practices like tillage, cover crops, manure transport, things of that sort. And then the second page is all of those structural practices, the buffers, the animal waste management systems, the fencing for prescribed grazing, all of that stuff we account for on an annual basis out to 2025. So where are we? Again, this is pounds of nitrogen delivered to the bay. Just looking real quickly where we started out in 95 to where we need to be by 2025. We started out at 34 million pounds and we need to get to 18. This is just for Maryland agriculture, by the way. So you can see our latest progress runs, we're down to 22.05 or 22 million pounds. We need to get to 18. So we're about 4 million pounds short. So we have 5 years to make up 4 million pounds, which is going to be a challenge, but we think we can chip into that quite a bit. Not sure if we're going to hit 18, but we hope to get that number below 20 for sure. And then looking at the individual practices, if we were to say, well, okay, we put this plan together, how close are we to getting all these practices implemented? Well, the bar is set at 100%, so that meaning that we hit our target. You can see that we are very close in some, whether it's our forest buffers or tree plantings, and we're still significantly behind when it comes to some of our pasture management systems like prescribed grazing, horse pasture management, and then even our ag drainage management practices. So we have a lot of room to make up is the bottom line here. again, this is a good takeaway and will help maybe set the stage for Mark talking about the Clean Water Commerce Act a little bit too. So some real quick highlights. We have, almost 900,000 acres of farms under a conservation plan, 936,000 in compliance with nutrient management. Last year we planted 488,000 in cover crop, and we have almost 800,000 in conservation tillage. So these are huge numbers. And if you go back and look at the stats of 1.3 million, we have pretty good coverage on a lot of these things. Real quickly to talk about programmatic highlights. We recently were able to procure 53 additional positions at our conservation district offices to help us with additional technical assistance. That's been a huge driver for us. So I talked with our operations manager Byron a little while ago, and he said that he's got 140 employees out in the field offices once we hire everyone. So 140 positions, MDA positions alone, in 24 conservation district offices. That's a huge change for us, or basically a lot more in terms of the resources that are available to farmers to help them meet their concerns on their farms. We have soil health and climate change initiatives underway. There's some recent legislation that helped us with our soil health program, and obviously there's a Maryland Commission on Climate Change, and we have certain objectives that we need to meet with them. And there have been recent legislative changes, and I'll touch on a few of those and then turn it over to Mark to talk more specifically about some of the others. So here recently, this past legislative session, Senate Bill 344, this is a departmental bill that was passed that actually increased the amount of cost share assistance that is available to farmers. So traditionally, our MAX program that pays for those structural practices, we were limited to 87.5%. The farmer would have to pick up the other 12.5%. Realizing that we have that 4 million pound gap, we were able to successfully have the law change to allow for 100% reimbursement on all eligible costs through the MAX program now. And this was effective as of August 2nd of this year. There are some stipulations that come along with that, however. And I think this was mentioned previously about conservation plans are usually required for just about everything. Well, in this case, you have to have a conservation plan and a current one to be eligible for that 100% cost share. Only key BMPs are eligible for that 100% as well. And that's consistent with that chart that I just showed a minute ago, these ones that are the laggards, if you will. So these are the ones that are eligible for the 100% cost share. Not every practice in the MAX suite is eligible, but certainly the key ones that we're behind on are eligible. And then one other key provision in that legislation was that the 100% language actually sunsets in 2026. So we'll revert back to 87.5 following that. Other changes, not necessarily legislatively, but through regulation and policy, is we recognize that, and I'm sure everyone's experienced this, that material costs have risen tremendously, and it's no different for these materials that help us with put these projects in the ground. So prices of concrete, lumber, all of that stuff have gone up as a result of COVID. So we've allowed for a 30% increase in our flat rates that we have, and we just published a regulation change that's going to increase our funding cap from $50,000 to $75,000 per project to help meet those rising costs. And then we also increased the amount of cost share from $25 to $28 per ton for our manure transport program. Some other key pieces of legislation that were notable pieces of legislation: Senate Bill 616 was another piece that was passed this last session that authorized the establishment of Baltimore City Soil Conservation District. I mentioned that We have 24 right now, but the city does not. This legislation actually allows us to establish or authorize the establishment of that. One of the challenges that we face with this is back when the districts were originally formed back in the 30s and 40s, there was rules on how those were formed legislatively, or I'm sorry, in law. That law has since been repealed because I guess at the time they thought that we weren't going to form any new conservation districts. So right now, our attorney general's office is looking at ways to explore the legal mechanism to establish a new conservation district in light of the fact that the initial law was actually repealed back in the 60s. So more to come on that, but we're obviously supportive of the concept of creating a conservation district in Baltimore City to help address the unique challenges within urban agriculture. And then finally, House Bill 269 was a specific bill that was passed last year regarding urban agriculture program. So it established a program at MDA to increase the viability of urban farming and improve access to urban grown foods. So there's a fund that was established, and it also authorizes the governor to include appropriation for that fund. As of yet, it is unfunded, but we look forward to engaging with our urban agriculture community and ensuring that all of their needs are met. And with that, I'll just stop there. I'm sorry for going long, and I'll maybe just hold off. I think, Mark, we're going to do comments at the end, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, I guess I'm on. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for sticking with me. Batting cleanup's not always the best spot, but I'm glad to do it today. My name is Mark Hoffman. I'm the Maryland Director for the Chesapeake Bay Commission, and I'm going to be talking today about agricultural policy for the Bay. That's the policy for the Bay is for the tagline for the Commission, and today we're going to focus on what we've been doing in the past and future related to ag. And Jason references, I'm going to go through the first group of slides pretty quickly, but this all really dates back into the mid-1970s when it was noticed that there were some real water quality issues in the Chesapeake, and Senator Mathias ordered a very large EPA study of the Bay watershed, which, because it really wasn't understood at that time, what was the problem. We take a lot of the science today for granted, but that didn't exist back in the 1970s. And what we found was that particularly in the main stem of the bay and in the larger tributaries, there were very low to no dissolved oxygen levels during certain times of the year. And of course, without oxygen, all the life we appreciate, the crabs and the striped bass and the things they feed on, couldn't survive. So we've been working since then in Maryland in particular, but throughout the watershed to try to address and reverse those trends. And as Jason said, we really have made a lot of progress. Often it's not appreciated to the extent to which things have improved, but given the fact that the kind of an easy way to think about this is that since the mid-70s, the population within the watershed is about doubled, while at the same time the nutrient loadings to the bay have been about cut in half. So that's a pretty good metric of the progress that we've been able to make. And related to this, let me just for a minute talk about the organization. I work for the Chesapeake Bay Commission. We often get confused with other organizations. Back at the very beginning of the efforts to restore the bay, folks realized that for us to be successful, the state legislatures in Maryland and Virginia would have a very important role to play. They pass policy through legislation. They also, depending on the state, have a very important role in the budget process. And we knew this was going to obviously cost a lot of money. So back in '80, the commission was established. It has originally it was just Maryland and Virginia, but it was soon thereafter expanded to include Pennsylvania, given their importance to the Bay restoration. There's 7 members from each state, 2 senators, 3 delegates or representatives, 1 representative of the governor, which is usually the secretary of the DNR or the MDE, and then 1 citizen. And our goal is to take the science and all the information, the fire hose of information that's generated related to the Bay, and translate that into policy recommendations that our members can potentially put into law. It also provides a forum where each of the 3 states, we meet quarterly, and the legislatures from each state can compare notes. They hear the same information, and they can work together. Things are always different, what they enacted. It's never the exact same in each state. Each has its own political history, its own demographics, its own nuances, but at the same time, often the end result is the same. The commission is also a member of the Chesapeake Bay Program Partnership. This is the more formal body that sort of governs the efforts to restore the Bay. It's comprised of all the jurisdictional, the states within the watershed, the District of Columbia, the commission, and the Environmental Protection Agency. And EPA represents all federal agencies. There's a lot of, whether it's Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, National Park Service, DOD, there's a lot of engagement of across the whole gamut of federal agencies in the Bay restoration effort. There have been, and I just originally I have this is as you can imagine, this is part of some of these slides are from other presentations. There's four different slides about all the legislation that's been passed since the foundation of the commission, and this is just some highlights, things that touch on the ag sector. I'm not going to go into them, but forest conservation and rural legacy, animal waste technology, etc. So the commission and its members have had a significant hand in the litany of state laws that have been passed in the last 40 years to further watershed restoration. Additionally, again, on the funding side, that's a very important component. And for example, and Jason referred to it, the Bay Restoration Fund. This is, I don't know whether it's met in a good way, but the infamous flush tax. This is the money that is, although it's used, both wastewater and septic users have to pay into this fund. But what it's done, the main, quite frankly, the main driver, and Jason showed it in his pie charts of the success we've had, has been upgrading all of our major wastewater treatment facilities to enhance nutrient reduction. And this has only been possible through the funding of the Bay Restoration Fund. We've spent just over $1 billion to upgrade the 57, although there's a couple still in progress, but really to upgrade the 57 major wastewater treatment plants that are handling tens of millions of gallons of effluent daily. So this is really what's allowed us to turn the tide and reduce nitrogen loading into the Bay. And at the same time, fund has also provided a lot of funding for the cover crop program, for example. It's the septic component. Septic is a little more difficult to deal with. It's a very diffuse system. There's no central pipe where you can clean up the effluent. So a way to effectively offset some of the septic loads was to fund things like the cover crop program, which has been hugely successful. The commission is also very active on the federal side, and I'll talk once more about this later. Back in the late 2000s, early 2010s, we were able to achieve what's called the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Initiative. This provided an additional $260 million of federal funding to support agricultural BMPs within the watershed. And we're working on a similar program. I'll just give you a tease. We're working on a similar program right now. And this provided the impetus to support ag BMPs throughout the watershed. as Jason met, he kind of went over this a little bit already, but we're in a more arguably regulatory mode. At the beginning, we tried sort of really voluntary compliance activities for a long time, although this ag stuff is always has been and still is to a large extent voluntary. But it just quite frankly was not achieving the outcomes that were needed to have a fishable and a swimmable bay. So in 2010, there was a lot of science done and a TMDL was established. And this is basically defining how much pollution. It's not as if we're not trying to get to zero pollution. We're trying to get to set limits. And if we get to these limits, we'll address those dissolved oxygen levels. So how much pollution can the bay assimilate on an annual basis and still allow life to prosper? So this was the TMDL was established in 2010. The first phase 2 WIPs in 2012. There was a midpoint assessment in 2017, and in 2019, the phase 3 WIPs were done, and the goal clearly is to have all practices in place by 2025 to meet our water quality standards. The commission itself has been very active in turning more on the ag side. On ag, we've done a number of policy reports related to agriculture. In 2015, we published Healthy Livestock, Healthy Streams, which really provides the rationale for trying to keep our waterways and our livestock separate. Maryland's done a very good job in implementing policy and regulations to do this, and it really does provide incredible water quality benefits. And at the same time, one of the other topics we talk about, and has been alluded to today, is technical assistance. In 2017, we published a technical report, Boots on the Ground, Improving Technical Assistance for Farmers. It came up with a number of policy recommendations to address the deficiencies in technical assistance in terms of compensation, turnover, training, et cetera, and things that we really need to do a better job of to improve the availability and the quality of technical assistance to our agricultural community. And if I could, this next chart, it's a little complicated, but I'm going to try to walk through it because this really sort of explains or illustrates why there's so much focus on agriculture at the moment. So this starts back. This is where this chart is of where the nitrogen reductions are coming from. So if you start back in 1985, when all of this accounting started, and it goes up to 29. The first increment is 2019, the midpoint assessment, and then it's projected out to 2025, which is our ultimate goal for the TMDL. And you can see we have two sectors still have increasing loads. Both the septic and the developed, i.e. the stormwater loads, are continuing to increase. There's a lot of effort particularly on stormwater. But as we know, stormwater is extremely expensive to retrofit a lot of our older communities. So there's a lot of attention. There's a lot of all the MS4 permitting our major jurisdictions are under. So they're working to address that. And we do project it to decline between 2019 and 2025. But at this point, it's not an incredibly significant role in achieving the overall goals. The brown color here is the wastewater, and you can see how big a piece of this graph that is, where that's really been taking up the bandwidth of the reduction since 1985. And what I want to focus on is the green, which is agriculture. And you can see we've really made, as Jason mentioned, we've really made good progress in agricultural reductions since 1985. But to get to where we need to be, down at that little bottom, there's a chunk of that green triangle that's got some cross-hatching on it, where it says agriculture faces largest share of remaining reductions. So basically, we've pretty much we've reached our capacity limits in terms of cleaning up wastewater. So there just isn't the pollution coming from that sector that we can address at the moment. So ag effectively has to we work with them to try to make up that balance. Okay, so now on to the kind of the crux of the today's presentation, to talk about legislation. There's been some discussion earlier today about some of the bills that passed in that first session. I'm going to focus on four other pieces of legislation that the commission was involved in. First was the Clean Water Commerce Act that was sponsored by three of our members, Delegate Stein and Senators Guzon and Elfreth. Also, the House Bill 860 was the Ag Preservation Goal, and then the Tree Solutions Act of 2021. And then Jason, Jason already went and talked about the Ag Cost Sharing Bill quite a bit, so I'll go over that very briefly. So on the Clean Water Commerce Act, this was a piece of legislation that passed originally in 2017. It started as an administration bill, was heavily amended with commission input. And what's happened with the money in the BRF, the Bay Restoration Fund, has those large wastewater treatment facilities have been addressed. Effectively the cost per pound has gone up dramatically. So it's much less cost effective to do E&R at a small wastewater treatment plant than it is to do it on a plant that does 10 million gallons of flow a day. So it was a way to take a small piece of that BRF and basically go out to the private sector and say, hey, you come to us with your projects and we'll award funding to that sector or that project that can provide those nutrient reductions at the lowest price point. And we have many appropriators on the commission. Senator Guzon is currently chair of the Senate Budget and Taxation Committee. Senator Elfreth's on that committee. Delegate Bridges in the House is a member of the commission. He sits on House Appropriations. So there's always been a high sensitivity and concern among our members to ensure that taxpayer dollars were being spent in the most cost-effective way. And this bill, when it was passed, it had a sunset in 2021, which was this year. So we worked on this bill quite a bit. We extended the sunset to 2030, which is when the BRF funds. Currently, there was a doubling of the BRF several years ago. That sunsets in 2030. That would time when the Clean Water Commerce would also sunset. It increases the funding from 10 million to 20 million annually. And in the first iteration of Clean Water Commerce, the ag community specifically asked that they be exempted, that no ag projects be purchased with the funding under this. We worked very closely. We had a great work group with members from the Farm Bureau and the Grain Producers Association. And we made it very clear, and that's kind of number 5 on this slide, to make it very clear that whatever sector, wherever that reduction is coming from, that sector gets credit for that reduction. There was concern that people would be buying reductions and basically using them to offset their problems, and ag would not be getting credit for those. So we made sure that would not happen pursuant to this bill. Also, given the importance of agriculture in terms of achieving our overall goals, there's actually a sector-based set aside. So 35% of that $20 million must be spent in the ag space. That said, more of it could be because the main determiner of which projects are funded is cost-effective nitrogen reductions. So clearly it's anticipated that ag may even get a larger percentage of the pie than the 35%. Also, it's important, there's a lot of money with the cover crop program going into annual practices. There's continues to be focus to expand funding for permanent practices, and a Clean Water Commerce has that written into it. The next bill, just briefly, is House Bill 860. This is the State Planning and Preservation of Agricultural Goal. Back in 2002, the General Assembly passed joint regulations to establish a statewide goal for ag land preservation to be achieved by 2030. This codifies that. I'm sorry, actually, I think it was earlier than 2030. It was, I think, 2021. This codifies that in state law and then extends the deadline to 2030. And also it makes it clear that certain programs like the Next Gen program, which is administered by Marbidco, is included in that count of preserved ag land. The House Bill 991, which it started out one way and was very heavily amended to become the Tree Solutions Now Act of 2021. This bill has a 10-year sunset, terminates in 2031. The goal here is to plant an additional 5 million native trees in the state by 2031. There's a lot of details on how that's to be done, how the funding for that is going to work. There's a tree program coordinator and their staffing within the Department of Natural Resources to help do that. And clear, there was a lot of input from the community. Obviously, one of the big concerns on these types of things is the maintenance on these trees. As we know, you can't just put a seedling in the ground and walk away. There's maintenance. We have a lot of issues with invasive. We have a lot of issue with herbivores, and that's all part of the trying to do that, to address that. And on the specific to agriculture, there's specific language that a landowner that enrolls in the program, if it's a part of a CREP project, they would receive $1,000 an acre sign-up bonus. So there'd been some research, and they felt that this was an appropriate price point to try to encourage CREP enrollment. In Maryland, CREP is enrollment's gone up and down over time in the state, but certainly it's hopefully this bonus payment would help further enrollment. And also there's a commission, as I alluded to help kind of oversee this whole project and try to make this all become reality. This is the bill. I'll just skip over this. Jason talked about Senate Bill 344. This is the bill that increased the cost share from 87.5% to 100%. Now I'm going to talk about 2022 legislation. And this is very specific to things that the commission is directly involved in. I can't obviously speak for, there's a lot of advocacy and groups in this space, and I'm just going to focus on one bill in particular that we've been working in with our both Delegate Stein and Senator Elfreth. And this is back in 2021 or earlier this year, Senate Bill 737 passed the Senate. It was the Comprehensive Conservation Finance Act. The bill has a lot of moving parts. It amends Ag's Code and Natural Resources, the procurement article, natural resources article. But I'm going to just talk today briefly about those parts that are specific to agriculture. It does amend the Maryland Agriculture Water Quality Cost Share Program provisions to make it clear that if someone is receiving funding for a project through MAX, that if they're doing something else, if they're doing some other conservation benefit that is producing a carbon credit, or some carbon benefit, that they would be free to sell that credit or that carbon reduction to a third party. Part of the bill, there's a number of provisions in these bills to try to encourage private our landowners to engage in the private carbon markets, and this is one of them. It also authorizes MDE to work with these private sector organizations that have experience in this area to work with landowners, and maybe MDA could be sort of an intermediary or help our agriculture producers benefit from these programs. And kind of on the same line, there's very similar language. A lot of the farmland in the state is under easement through Maryland Environmental Trust or the Rural Legacy Program, and this has the same provisions, so that even if your land was under an easement through those programs, if you were doing something else that wasn't covered by the easement to provide ecosystem services that could be sold to a third party, then you'd be able to do that. And as long as they don't impair or interfere with the conservation values of the original easement. There's also there's a lot of interest in on the carbon side. Obviously, forested land is critical to that, and they're working with private landowners to sell their carbon credits in the private sector, but often they need to have a guarantee or a backstop if there's something doesn't work right, or the say it's a new forest and the trees don't live. There needs to be some sort of backstop, and this actually is, there's provision in this bill that would allow a new forest on state lands to effectively guarantee those kinds of potential private actions. So it's where landowners could work cooperatively with the state to better address needs and be able to sell those carbon credits. Finally, we are still very active in the federal arena. I would be remiss if I didn't mention we are working very hard. I'm sure you've all know about the components of the infrastructure bill. At the same time, the second proposal that's currently in Congress, related to federal programs, there is, as we understand it, substantial enhancement to Farm Bill programs within that. And we were working very hard to secure additional funding for USDA and for NRCS and FSA to expand funding for BMP implementation. And we've done quite a bit of analysis. We're asking for $737 million over 10 years. And we feel this would really put us over the hump. There's still some real, as Jason alluded to, there are some funding challenges in the agricultural sector, and we want to continue to have voluntary, cost share programs, and we're working very hard on this Chesapeake Resilient Farm Initiative. And that's it. That's my contact info, and I think with that, I'll turn it over to our moderator. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks to Mark and Jason. The presentations were great. We got a few questions in the chat, and I think Jason is able to address some of them. Looks like Joanne and Colby have put some questions in.
Yeah, thanks, Joanne. I was reading through your questions regarding, well, first the nutrient management credit, if you will, for sequestering legacy phosphorus, et cetera. So while nutrient management planning itself, as it relates to sequestering phosphorus, is not necessarily a creditable practice, planting alternative crops that would take up those nutrients, I think, could be eligible, depending on the circumstance. There are a number of different NRCS practices that we could utilize. One that comes to mind is perhaps like conservation cover. I know that there's been some discussion of using switchgrass and giant miscanthus and other things to help in some situations. So I think there are opportunities that we could certainly explore regarding that. In terms of the cover crop program and what counts and what doesn't, and why things are done a certain way. So traditionally, the Bay program has viewed cover crops as those crops that are absorbing excess nutrients as a result of the following, or I'm sorry, the previous crop. So after the harvest of corn or soybeans. So there was and this just goes overall with all the practices that are approved for use. There's expert panels that are formed that actually dictate how certain practices could be utilized to help us meet our goals. So there was a cover crop expert panel that actually met and provided recommendations on what counts and what doesn't, et cetera, and how much credit we get for each of those. So if you have specific examples of other things that we're currently not capturing, I think there's always opportunities to update or revise what's eligible. But that has to be done through the Bay program process. And then I see there was a question from Colby about the list of eligible BMPs that would qualify for the Clean Water Commerce Act. Colby and Mark, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I believe the language in the bill dictates that a priority is to be placed on fixed natural filter and agricultural drainage management practices. but it doesn't specifically state that it's limited to those. So I think it's just a priority on those practices, but certainly any WIP eligible practice I think could qualify.
Yeah, that's correct. And just so you know, Colby, the way this will probably roll out is MDE will be doing an RFP to solicit projects. So the presumption is that this is, the aggregators or the companies that sort of work, the NGOs or various will work and try to put a project proposal together and then submit that. And Jason described the current terms of it.
And it's important to note too that this is not a cost share type program. This is a paying for an environmental outcome. So it's on a price per pound of. In fact, the environmental outcome is nitrogen. So it's the price paid for reducing a pound of nitrogen as a result of implementing that practice. So it's a little bit different than traditional cost share mechanisms.
And on the comment on the final question about the native plants, that's a great point. And, part of that is I know we all know the litany of problems that these exotic invasive species have caused on the Maryland landscape. So so there's been there's a real concern for us not to make that problem worse. So the focus has always been on native, but you're correct that as climate changes, the range and the distributions of plants will shift. It is shifting accordingly, just as it is on the animal side. So that's a great point.
All right. Well, thank you both very much for those presentations. Very helpful explanations of a lot of technicalities as we're getting down to the deadline here with the bay cleanup. I certainly appreciate it. I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and thanks to our conference sponsors for making today possible. Our conference picks back up tomorrow at 9 a.m., so please tune in if you can. We're going to kick things off with my colleague Paul's Developing Issues in Agricultural and Environmental Law panel, always a popular one. He'll go over some highlights from the past year and let us know what we need to watch out for in the coming year. Then we have our keynote panel on carbon farming, definitely a hot topic. And last but not least, we've got a great set of presenters to talk about strengthening local food systems, the role of food policy councils, and the Certified Local Farm Enterprise Program. So thank you very much, and I hope everybody can tune in tomorrow.